So we have got 2 sessions between now and lunch. We're going to go until about 10:45. We may go a little bit long. We may go a little bit short. I'm not going to nail it right on 10:45. But we're going to make sure that there's a brief break. So if you need to stretch your legs, go use the bathroom, anything like that, then we'll come back in and get started again at 11. Once that session is over, there are some suggestions for lunch, and we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to that point. Before we launch into this morning's first session, were there any questions or any ideas that came to your mind after what we talked about last night? For those of you who were here last night. Yes?
This goes back to the first thing you were talking about being a married man, doing a singles. How old were you when you got married?
That's a great question. I was 22. I was 22 when I got married. My wife was 20 and had just finished 2 years of community college. Yeah, so I am 45. I just turned 45 last week, which means we're on 23 years of marriage. Yeah. But I'll tell you what, for a little bit of context, my parents got married straight out of high school. Right, so I grew up thinking that's the age that I ought to be when I got married, because that's what my parents did. So when I hit 20 and was currently in between relationships, I'm like, what is wrong with me? And so there's a lot about our expectations in relationships that gets shaped by our family unit, and then also the congregational setting that we're in. Like, what were the average ages that all those folks got married? Now, in contrast to that, I'm the oldest of 7 kids, right? For the longest time, I was the oldest of 6. My parents adopted a young man about 8 years ago, so I have an 18-year-old brother. One born out of 2 seasons. But before that, my sister was the youngest, right? So as far as marriage order, I'm the oldest. I should get married first. I did. And then my youngest sibling got married next. And then I have 2 unmarried brothers, obviously the youngest, but I have a brother who's in his early 40s on the West Coast, and he's still not married. The brother, just younger than me, didn't get married until he was 39. He was about ready to be like, I'm just going to be single. And he had really gotten to that place, and then someone connected him with someone in Hong Kong. So, good question. So, working with my siblings who have been single was really helpful as they shared with me and the rest of us what they were thinking and struggling through. Yeah. Yeah.
The man that encouraged you and inspired you to get here, what is his story? What does his walk look like now?
As far as what his walk looks like now, his name is Jeffrey D. Hutt, and he's a younger brother of mine. So just to share a little bit about his story, he dated in his early 20s. He was actually engaged twice to the same young lady and didn't marry her, ended up not marrying her. And he was really resigning himself to being single into his late 30s. And he had his own way of finding relationships or not, but God ended up matching him with someone across the world. And for him, getting married later in life was a blessing. I mean, I think he's a great husband. But he was a lot more mature when he entered marriage than when I entered marriage at 22. I'm telling my son, don't do it at 22. So, yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
I have a question, but Jane Ellen shared this morning, I just thought it was really good. She was talking about the similarities between the men we talked about last night and how they both had to do something to obtain the grace.
Yeah.
Really
Yeah, we were talking about that when I sat down at breakfast this morning too, and making the connection that what they did was in response to their faith, right? They believed or trusted in something about Jesus, which led them to respond a certain way. So in order for them to benefit from the grace in those moments, their faith had to be biblical faith. It was a faith that responded. So yeah, that was a great similarity between the two that we didn't talk about last night. Very good. Okay, well then let's move on to our first session today, a fresh look at singleness. And When I'm working with the congregation as a located evangelist and I'm not doing a workshop, this is usually the lesson that I give to our church to kind of introduce the topic, right? So this is usually where I tell the story about getting that phone call in my late 20s, and why I became more aware of this and trying to connect with people that needed serving it for more than one reason. So something else I'll share with you about the time that I got that phone call. I had recently moved to Indianapolis to work with the Avon Heights congregation on the west side of town. And the two elders that were there, they had received training in biblical counseling. Both the elders and their wives had gone through a training course to figure out how to use the Bible to serve people with a variety of different needs. Okay, so they were providing counseling using the Bible for premarital and marital counseling. They were using it for disordered eating. They were using it for addictions. They were using it for emotional issues. And so when I moved there, they were like, hey, Jeremy, you're going to be our new evangelist, but we'd like you to have some of the same tools in your toolbox that we've got. We want you to know how and why we do what we do here. So they had me go through the training in my late 20s on how to use the Bible to help people work through whatever they're trying to work through as a disciple. Really, it's just like advanced disciple making. You know, someone becomes a Christian, and then they get stuck with whatever they bring to the table, okay? And going through that process heavily influenced me learning to do this better and some other things better. And really, I wished I had gone through that training in my early 20s instead of my late 20s. Like, there was a whole decade I could have benefited from that. So some of what you're going to be hearing this weekend, and even some of my presentation style, has been influenced by that. And if you have more questions about that, even as single people, that's something that you can use. If you work with summer camps or kids or college-age students or whatever, those are some really handy tools to have in your toolbox. All right. So let me share just some statistics with you that probably aren't going to shock you. I actually went through this last week and did some more research to see what the current stats were. So several years ago, someone did a comparison of the percentage of Americans ages 18 years old or older who were married versus those who were not married. Okay, so in 2017, it was a 50-50 split between adult Americans who were married and unmarried. Okay, now compare that, go back about 27 years to 1990, and the pie looks like that, where you have 58% who were married and 42% who were not. And my guess would be, if you were to keep going back a decade at a time, that purple part of the pie would get bigger. Okay, so the point is this, that culturally here in America, fewer people are married, fewer adult people are married than previous generations. Okay, I'm not surprised by that. Are you guys surprised by that? Okay. Let me share another stat. So this one is the percent of men and women ages 25 and older who have never been married, going back to about 1960. And do you see the growing trend? Okay. I'm also not surprised that women get married younger than men, because, let's face it, women are more mature than us at a younger age. They just are. Like, that has always been the case, and some of the women are nodding their heads and giggling. But what you look and see there is that they're getting married older. Here's another one. This is the average age of first marriages by gender, going all the way back to 1890 to 2018. And you see a really big dip in the 1950s to 1960s. Like, people were getting married really, really, really young. So, like, those were my grandparents. So they're the ones that lived through the Great Depression. They're the ones who went through the Second World War. They're the ones. And so if you think back to your grandparents and their friends and you ask them, so how old were you when you got married? And they're like, 15. You're just like, who let you? Like, the whole country was doing that. Okay. But after that generation, the average age started getting older for their first marriage. So, like, for men, back in 2018, the average age for a first marriage was almost 30. And for women, it was almost 28. What do you guys think about those numbers? There's a new one. Same data, but it's more current. They went back, they were able to go back to 2023. We don't have the numbers for 2024 yet, and it's actually a little bit older. They finally crossed the threshold. The average age for a man getting married for the first time is 30. And for the women, it's just a little bit older. I think it's above 28 there. What do you think about that?
Families are going to be smaller.
Okay, so that's true. I mean, the later in life that you get married, that means there's a whole decade plus of childbearing years where you didn't have children. Okay? Or for like my brother who got married when he was almost 40. You know, I got married at 22. Keenan was born when I was 23. Right? And then we had a couple of kids after that. So yeah, it affects the population growth numbers. It does. And these numbers are worse in some other countries. Like that's a whole deal about population growth, that we're not keeping up as a culture. But what else?
The sexual revolution. You no longer have to get married to enjoy intimacy.
Yeah.
And you have the birth control pill. So you're no longer committed to one partner.
Yeah. Yeah, so this is what's fascinating about these numbers, okay? And I normally point this out. These are numbers. These aren't reasons. Like all this does is give you cold data. It doesn't explain to you why that data is the way that it is. Like it doesn't explain what the women were thinking, what the men were thinking, what their potential was for making a match or not, whether they were rural America or they lived in a big town, the average size of their congregation. Like we don't know any of that from these numbers. It's just a stat. But what that means is if these stats are pretty close to true, and I'm going to be reviewing these stats and sharing these stats with the church here tomorrow. What that means is you're going to see those stats reflected in your churches, which means you're going to have people that are not married at an older and older age. Like this has never been married. This doesn't address divorce. This doesn't address widowhood. This is just people that have not been married, right? And what this also doesn't address is it does not address whether they're cohabitating. That's not marriage. Okay, so there are all these other side things that we could talk about. There's a societal shift going on. One of the things that you could factor in is, well, what about education level? What about, there's so many other questions to ask. Yeah?
I think a big part of it is increases in cost of living over the years. You know, I think when you were in if you were 20 in the 50s, you got out of high school and you got a job in a factory and you could afford a house and a wife and 2 kids and all that.
Yeah.
You know, go through high school, 4 years of college, spend a few years building up your career, paying off your debt, and then you're ready to have a family and, you know.
How old are you, Grant? Okay, 26 years old, and he's talking about the economy. Yes, but I mean, that's true. The cost of living has gone up. The interest rates are higher. The mortgage rates are through the roof. The cost of houses, the inflation has just exploded. Like when I moved here to Texas, I had to tell the elders, look, you're asking me to move to Texas. That is not like living in rural Kentucky where I can get an acre for $6,000, right? Like it's a big deal for us to move here economically. But you think about people who are launching their adult life, and it costs a lot more than when their parents started their adult life. Although I will say, I've had this conversation with my dad, right? So I was born in 1979. My parents got married in 78. And in 1983, 84, they bought a house and the interest rate was 14%.
Compared to what fraction of their income?
A lot. Thank you, Jimmy Carter. So like, there are generational cycles, right? But when I got out and got started, like one of my last mortgage rates was like 3 point something, okay? And my first house cost $112,000. Which is nothing. Like even back then, that was nothing. So there are economic factors to consider. I know that's a part of it. Yes?
There's also a sense of self-sufficiency.
Yes?
You know, we value our self-sufficiency where I think back in like the 1960s, people were more reliant on each other.
Yeah. So I'll share this with one of my single friends who will remain nameless. I was talking to them, it was a man, and I was talking to him about being single, and he was a serial dater. Like he would date somebody and they'd get pretty serious, and as they got pretty serious, he's like, parachute, and he'd just like bail. And I was asking him as he got into his mid-30s, this is not that brother, what he thought about his prospects for getting married. And he's like, the older I get, and that's fair, he was in his mid-30s, the older that I get, the more self-reliant I am. And like I'm settling into who I am and what my habits are and what my routine is, and I just don't know if I want to change any of that. And I know that if I met someone and got married, I would have to. And I just don't know if I want to do it. So for that man, it was like Popeye, I am what I am. I don't know if I want to change. And the older you get and the more ingrained those patterns become, it's harder to shift from that. Yes?
I'm wondering, because our American culture, I wonder if it's our individualism coming to fruition
Yeah.
throughout the generations. But I could be wrong, but I thought I've heard that like internationally birth rates are falling.
Yes.
So I wonder, is this also the case in countries that are much more family-centric?
So there are parts of the world, and I'm not trying to bash anybody or anything, okay? I'm just sharing statistics. In parts of the world that are less educated and economically doing worse, the marriage rates are higher and the birth rates are higher. In countries where the economies are doing better and the education is higher, their birth rates are lower. And that's just like, it is what it is. Now, there are some other countries where there are some other factors at play. So you go to Asian countries, especially China. For decades, China has been fighting this birth rate deal, but they're also a culture that's like, you get one kid and it has to be a boy. Well, that's a problem. I mean, you play that out over a few generations and you're in trouble. But like, that's a cultural element that we don't have here. But they've got that. So those are some things to play into it. Now, look, I'm going to make this joke, and I'm going to make it tomorrow, and it's going to be interesting to see how the rest of the congregation takes this joke. You share these stats, and what we're saying is there is an increasing number of never been married people that are staying unmarried longer in life. Okay, whether they choose to or not, like those are just the facts. And you are going to hear some really sweet, like grandmotherly figure in the congregation. She's going to be like, challenge accepted. I'm going to match them all up. I'm going to fix them all up. Like, they're going to hear these numbers and be like, we're going to bring that number down. You're going to have some yentas out there. And I'm going to make that joke so I can say, stop it. Okay? It's not your job to change those numbers. Okay? This is just to bring awareness to the fact that some things are changing in our culture from several decades ago, and therefore they're different in our congregation from several generations ago. And we just need to acknowledge that, and what do we do with that? So I was really grateful. Last night after our first session, I went out and I was talking to Mr. Torno, one of the elders here, and he said, we actually went through our directory and we counted it up, and between folks who have never been married, folks who've been divorced, and folks who've been widowed, there are like 50 plus people in our congregation that are single. It's like, good for you that you know that number. Like, that's great. You should be aware of that number. Now, what are you doing with that number? And what they're doing is this, and some other things, I'm sure. So it's just dealing with reality. Does that make sense? And helping the congregation to think about that. And this is to give you more concrete information as you have this conversation. But the fact that you all chuckled at that joke means it's real. Okay, and we're going to talk about people's perspective on singleness and needing to fix that. Okay, especially in this lesson, we'll start on that. I want to share a quote with you from an author, Owen Strachan. Of the many cultural shifts the church did not see coming down the pike, and possibly at the top of the list, may be the growth of singleness. I agree with that. I think that's true. Especially in larger congregations, more urban congregations, you're going to see those numbers more closely match the culture at large. Okay? And we need to be aware of that and handle that well. Before we jump into some principles for singleness, we've got to talk about principles for marriage. I'm sorry. Like you thought you were coming to a singles workshop. We're going to talk about marriage. But there's a reason for that. Okay, and I'll share some of those reasons as we go. It is possible that the longer you are single, whether it's single never married, single divorced, or single widowed, the longer you're in that season of life, if you're not careful, it's really easy to develop some negative attitudes toward people who are married. Like you can make some assumptions about them and get frustrated with them. Okay? So I'm going to give you an example away from marriage, and then I'll bring it back to marriage. And, I brought a topic up last night, and it might have caught some of you off guard, so I'm going to bring it up again. And it's not off topic. Like, you guys can talk to me about this. You can talk to my wife about this. Any of my kids, like, it's our story, right? So Keenan was born in 2003. His younger brother, Cooper, was born in 2005. Our next son, Whitaker, was born in 2007. Okay, Cooper was special needs. Whitaker was special needs. Cooper had autism and epilepsy. He passed in 2016 when he was almost 11. Whitaker had extreme cerebral palsy, low muscle tone cerebral palsy. He passed in 2013 when he was 6. He had just turned 6. Okay, so we had these special needs guys that took a lot of time and energy. Like they shaped the atmosphere of our home, not in a negative way, but it was different than if we had had perfectly healthy little boys. Okay, and that meant that we were blessed with a great church family that served us and helped us. Like my family and Anna's family did a great job of serving us and helping us. One of our limitations was we were not able to travel like other families could travel. Like Whitaker, our CP son, struggled sitting up and being in a car seat for long periods of time, which means you don't travel very much. Like it's hard to get on airplanes, it's hard to go on vacations. So we were living in Indianapolis. My parents were living in Louisville, which is 2 to 2.5 hours away. And we would try to go down once a month or so to visit them, see grandma and grandpa, all that jazz. And there was one Sunday we went down and I preached, and then afterwards we went out to this restaurant, which is a big deal because we didn't get to do that a whole lot. One of Cooper's deals with his epilepsy was he had grand mal seizures every 14 days on the nose, like almost his entire life, right? And then he had to recover for 24 hours, which means we had to stay home for 24 hours. So anyway, it was a big deal that we got to go out as a family because we had a family to help us. So we went to this barbecue restaurant, which was not as good as like Texas barbecue. We'll just get that out of the way. It was a faux barbecue restaurant. And Anna and I were really excited because we're like, we're going to get to sit with other adults at like a restaurant and communicate and have adult conversation. And my dad sorted out who was sitting where, and they put me and Anna in a booth by ourselves. And we're sitting across the table from each other in this nice restaurant, and I'm like, I love you, but I kind of wanted to. And she's like, yeah, me too. And so Dad came over, and he's like, hey, is everything going great? I'm like, it's fine. He was like, huh? And he went away, and he came back, are you sure it's okay? I'm like, I said it's fine. It wasn't fine. And he's like, so what's going on? Like, I feel bad. And like, my dad's 6'2", and so he's stooping down. What's going on? I'm like, look. Like, we never get to interact with adults and blah, 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 and you knew that, and you put us at the table by ourselves. And he felt so bad because what he was thinking was, like, Jeremy and Anna never get to go out and do something by themselves, so we're going to keep the kids. And here's what happened with that whole deal. My dad made some assumptions about what he thought we needed and was serving us the way that he thought he could serve us. We made the assumption that Dad knew what was going on with us and would just know that we needed adult interaction, and he didn't. And so I share that to say it's really easy to start making assumptions about a different group than you or a different person from you and vice versa. And when you make those assumptions, it creates a mess. Okay? And I'll just praise my dad. Like on the spot, he's like, we're going to reshuffle. And so he reshuffled the tables, and the kids got split up and the adults got split up. And that just tells you something about my dad. He's awesome. Right? But that's why we're talking about marriage for just a second. Because sometimes people are in a season of singleness and never married because they've developed some attitudes about marriage that just aren't right. And so we just want to make sure to go through and see what the Bible actually has to say about those things. All right, so the first is, God created marriage and it's good. The biblical reference up there is Genesis chapter 2. You could actually go back to Genesis chapter 1. When God says, let us make man in our image, male and female, he created them. And then at the end of chapter 1, as God is surveying all the things that he's made in the creation week, he says it was very good. And then it goes on to explain how Adam and Eve came to be created in Genesis chapter 2. Okay? And so marriage is not bad. Like if you talk to some people, and I get it, how do we develop our perceptions on marriage? We talked about it a little bit ago. What's that?
Your parents and or other people in the congregation.
Yeah, your environment, right? You start to develop these perceptions or ideas based on your experience. Like I've got friends and they had horrible family lives growing up. Marriage was not a pretty picture for them. And I'll just share, like in my extended family, overall, marriage was not a pretty picture. Like my grandparents, my mom's parents, married and divorced each other 4 times. And then got to the point where divorce was just not practical, and so they lived perpetually separated for decades. That's how my mom grew up. Like marriage was ugly. And if she had let it, she could have let those experiences shape her perception about marriage. Like, I'm never going to trust a man like that. I'm never going to whatever. But God says what he created, what he designed, and what he intended is good. We mess it up, but what God designed is good. Does that make sense? Okay. Second thing, marriage reflects a greater relationship, that of Christ with the church. Turn over to Ephesians chapter 5. We're going to save this point. Mark your Bible there. We're going to save this point. We're going to come back to it. You guys are familiar with Ephesians 5 and just the general principles there of the husband loving the wife as Christ loved the church, and the church submitting to Christ like the wife is supposed to submit to her husband, right? So we're just going to hit that high level, but we're going to spend some more time on that in just a minute. The third thing is this. You look at Genesis chapter 1 and verse 28, everything being very, very good, and chapter 2 and verse 24. In Genesis chapter 2, it's the marriage relationship where procreation is supposed to take place. Like that is the God-ordained relationship where children are supposed to come from, which is meant to be a blessing to those individual children, but eventually the creation at large, because you're actually starting to populate the world with more image bearers who are going to exercise dominion over it. Does that make sense? And so marriage is meant to be a blessing both to the spouses that are committed to each other in that covenant relationship, but that relationship is also meant to be a blessing to the other people around them and the world around them. You agree with that? Okay. Let me just throw this out there. What are some of the ways that you can think of or that you've thought of that marriage is a blessing to those who are in it?
You have a relationship that you can share anything with.
Okay, greater intimacy, right? Greater relational intimacy. I'm sorry? Okay, how would you paraphrase that? I've got your back. I'm thinking of the stick figure. I've got your back. What did you say, Ryan? Spousal support, sure. Companionship, another way of saying greater relational intimacy. But yeah, companionship, very good. Yes. Yeah, whether you want it or not. Look, I was the typical guy. Like I was living on my own for about 2 years in a 3-bedroom house before Anna and I got married. And within a week, she's like, "Do you ever pick up the clothes in the bottom of your closet?" I was like, "That's my dresser, like a deconstructed dresser. What's the problem?" Now I have to clean up my dresser. And in other ways too. Okay. The one that I was specifically thinking of is from Genesis chapter 2, where God takes Adam through the process of realizing that it's not good for him to be alone. So like as a kid, I remember hearing that story and I'm like, oh, that's kind of fun. God gave him a job. He's supposed to name all the animals. You know, oh, there's Mr. and Mrs. Aardvark, and there's Mr. and Mrs. Anteater, and there's Mr. and Mrs. Elephant, there's Mr. and Mrs. But it wasn't until I became an adult that I started thinking through, like as God was parading all of these mammals past Adam, and he sees all of these Mr. and Mrs., he's like, where's Mrs. Adam? When's she going to come out from the trees? And after however long it took him to name all those animals, God's like, she's not there. And Adam's like, she's not there. And then at the conclusion of that process, we have the statement, it's not good for man to be alone. Like Adam realizes there's no one else in the world that complements him like the other mammals. And that's when God's like, well, now that you've realized that, let's make you one. And he puts him to sleep and then takes a rib and fashions Eve and brings her out. And he's like, there she is. And so there's this idea of companionship, of not being alone, that is really, really important. And that need is ingrained in every image bearer, single or married. Every image bearer has the need to be known and to know others, to have a degree of relational intimacy. Now, there's a degree of that intimacy that is greater in marriage, but even as single people in their 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, like whatever decade, you have that need as well. And it's appropriate to have that need met in an appropriate way. You have to give some more thought and consideration on how to do that if there isn't a spouse. You still have that relational need. Have you ever said it quite that way? Okay, I'm going to say it a few more times that way this weekend. But that's true. We'll talk about it some more as we get to the counterpart to this slide on the singles side. Marriage can help guard against immorality, but it requires self-control. Okay, Hebrews 13:4 talking about let the marriage bed be undefiled. A couple other passages that are similar to that. Look, there's this mistaken notion, especially among men. They may struggle with sexual immorality, they may struggle with pornography, they may struggle with that kind of stuff, and they're like, if I just get married, then those kind of things won't be a struggle anymore. You are out of your ever-loving mind. If you think putting a ring on it is going to help you with addictive behavior that you've developed over years, you are sadly mistaken, and you're really going to hurt yourself and your spouse. Like, just getting married does not fix that. Does that make sense? And likewise for women, like if they get involved in some kind of addictive behavior, sometimes it's different forms of pornography or other relational intimacy. If they develop habits that way and then get married, those habits just don't die. You know, like when you become a Christian, you come up out of the water, your old patterns of sin don't just stay down there. You've got to learn how to live a self-controlled life. And so you get married, whatever habits you develop beforehand, you still have to figure out how to live a self-controlled life. Actually, the stakes are higher now. Does that make sense? Yes?
And often it stays in the I and me instead of the we unit now.
Oh, there you go.
You know,
Yeah,
selfishness.
absolutely. And I'll throw this out there too. If you are ever dating someone, if you're ever pursuing a spouse and you're trying to gauge whether this is going to be a good relationship or not, at some point prior to marriage, like I will not perform a marriage ceremony for someone if I haven't counseled with them. Like I just flat out refuse anymore because I want to know that they've been prepared as best as I can for marriage, right? But one of the things that we hit pretty early on in the marriage counseling process or premarital counseling process is what is your, or what has your physical intimacy life looked like. Because each prospective spouse needs to know what is a part of this package. What kind of exposure have you had? What kind of habits have you developed? What are you bringing into this relationship or not? And you need to be thinking about that as a single person right now because you're developing habits and all of those things right now. So what are you bringing to the table? And you need to know what a prospective spouse might be bringing to the table. And you need to know that, full disclosure, before the ring goes on. Does that make sense? I got kind of preachy there. But I'm pretty adamant about that because there has been so much bait and switching going on where, you know, people try to present themselves as, you know, I've never known about that, or I haven't, like, I don't struggle with pornography since about 12 hours ago. Like it was the last time. And then they get married and all of a sudden, like the day of the wedding, they're messing around and the spouse is like, what is this? It's a false bill of goods. Like you just sold yourself as a false bill of goods. So just getting married doesn't automatically address those behaviors, is what I'm saying. Yeah?
One,
Yes?
is it supposed to be Genesis 2:18 or 2:28? Not 28.
Then it's 18. Thank you. Do you know how many times I've taught this lesson And no one caught that typo? Now everyone's going to be fact-checking my references. Can you read that really quick?
You're gonna find it again.
Here we go, 2:18. Yeah, then the Lord God said, it's not good that man should be alone. I will make a helper fit for him. That's verse 18. And then it might be 24. Therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, or cleave to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. So either of those would work, verse 18 or verse 24, but not 28, because that's in the Jeremy Paraphrase Bible. Okay. Fifth point. Not everyone chooses or is free to marry. Matthew 19, and I know those are right. You got to get Matthew 19 right. Matthew 19, you have those folks that are questioning Jesus about divorce. The disciples said to him, if such is the case of a man with his wife, it is better not to marry. Like Jesus has just said, stay married for life. Those are the standards. And they're like, well, what about Moses? And he's like, well, Moses, out of the hardness of your heart, allowed you to divorce, but that was not God's original design, is what he says. And so they're like, man, if that's the case of a man with his wife, it's better not to marry. And Jesus' response in verse 11 is, not everyone can receive this saying. And the saying that he's referring to is what the disciples just said. Not what he just taught, but what the disciples just said, when they're like, man, everyone should just stay single, or stay single. He's like, no, not everyone can stay single. And then he has this really great verse 12. There are eunuchs who've been so from birth. There are eunuchs who've been made eunuchs by men. There are eunuchs who've made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Let the one who's able to receive this receive it. Like, not everyone chooses or stays single. And not everyone chooses or is free to marry. And we're going to spend more time on this a little bit later. But those are the 5 principles on marriage. Okay, so I want to make sure we see marriage the way God sees marriage. And that we're staying single because we have a flawed perspective. All right? Now, throw out some reasons. I've got 5. We're going to hit 5. But what are some reasons that you think that some people remain single?
Fear of needing to get divorced later, like the...
Okay, out of fear. Okay, fear of divorce. I thought you were going to be the typical, like, fear of commitment, man. Like,
Some may not want to put in the effort to find that.
it's a lot of work. It's a lot of work. Hey, when we got married, I had hair. It's a lot of work. Okay. Look, it was going before I got married. It's like, I got to get married quick. I'm losing my hair. Yes, negative trauma. Ian? They don't what? They don't feel good enough. What do you mean?
Confidence problems. They don't feel like they could be loved.
Okay. That's really good. Yeah.
To back up with him, I would say just a fear of being hurt because of past experiences.
Yeah, so if you've had a bad relationship, fear of entering into another bad relationship, and let me share something with you about Anna and I. I love my father-in-law. Love my father-in-law. When I actually called her dad and mom to ask permission to date her. And he was like, yeah, I guess that's all right. He was not a fan, okay? Her dad has known me since I was 8. And we had this extra wrinkle, okay? I had moved to the Midwest, and I dated 2 different girls really seriously. And both times, I flew my girlfriend back to Oregon to see where I grew up, and we stayed at my future in-laws' house. And they let me use their car to take this girlfriend around. And then a year later, I came back with another girlfriend to see where I grew up. And then like a year later, I was like, can I date your daughter? And Fred's like, no. Like, what kind of Christian player are you? And he challenged Anna. He's like, it's Jeremy. Are you sure? Like, it's Jeremy. And then about 6 months after we started dating, I called up her parents to ask for permission to marry her, to propose. And like, I do not remember what I said. I had this long speech written out, and by the end of the phone call, My father-in-law was so confused at what I was asking. He was like, well, yeah, I guess. And my mother-in-law was like, oh, that's so great. And he's like, what did I just agree to? And she's like, honey, you told Jeremy that he could marry Anna. He's like, I take it back. I didn't know that's what I was agreeing to. Now, his requirement was that she finish 2 years of community college. So we dated long distance for about 18 months. And the week before I flew out for the wedding, my father-in-law pulled Anna aside and he's like, are you sure? I'm like, it's not too late. I'm like, we'll cancel the whole thing and we'll pay for Jeremy to go home. And she was like, Dad. But what I'm saying is this. As the father of 2 daughters and all of the counseling that I've done, I totally get my father-in-law. I totally get it. Like, it is a big deal to entrust your daughter to somebody else, and especially the way that God describes the marriage relationship supposing to work, and she's supposed to submit to this flawed, messed up guy. That is freaky. Like, I'll add another little wrinkle to our relationship. Just before Anna and I got engaged, this whole group of friends out there, all these peers with all these kids about the same age, one of Anna's peers, the first one to get married, had gone through a divorce because within the first year of her marriage, she came home and realized that her husband was cross-dressing and doing all kinds of sexual stuff. And so the first marriage out of that whole peer group just went, and then I came waltzing in, hey, you want to get married? And they're like, like my life was threatened a half dozen times at our wedding reception. I know every person that owns guns in Oregon. Because they told me, if you mess up with Anna, like, I've got a gun. I'm like, right? So I get it, the idea of fear, right? It's a big commitment, especially for a girl marrying a guy. And I'm going to be just as protective of my daughters. What are some other reasons? Yeah. Yeah, loss of freedom. We're going to talk about that in a little bit more detail in the next one. Next lesson. Yeah.
Kind of on that fear point, the fear of trusting someone else.
Yeah. Okay, let's start throwing these up there. You guys put some good ones on there. Some people just say, I don't believe in marriage. Like, none of you threw that out there because plainly the Bible teaches that marriage is a relationship designed and created by God. But if you're not a Christian and you don't believe in the Bible, you think that marriage is a cultural construct. It's just something that we as a culture came up with as a matter of convenience. And some people would argue that our culture has evolved beyond that relationship. If you've never heard that, you will hear that at some point. So they're like, I don't believe in marriage. I want to live for myself first. So my friend that was like, the older that I get, the more set in my ways I am, and I just kind of like the way that I'm living. And he's like, it's what I want to do. I'm not ready yet. I love that answer. That's a great answer. Depending on what you do with it. So, an example of this, not in the realm of marriage, but in the realm of conversion. I remember when our oldest son, Keenan, we first started talking to him about becoming a Christian. And he was plainly thinking about it and wrestling with it. And it was after the death of his first brother. And we were talking about heaven and getting to see him again and all that kind of stuff. And like, he really wanted the hope of heaven. We wanted him to have the hope of heaven. And so we started talking about it. And we went through Ken Craig's Big Picture of the Bible flip chart. And he was all about it, and we got to the end, and I was really stressing. I'm like, so do you believe that Jesus is the Son of God? And he's like, oh yeah, man, I believe that. I was like, you believe everything that the Bible says? Yeah, I believe that. And in my head, I'm like, well, where's the baptistry? And I'm like, so is that a decision that you're ready to make tonight? And he's like, no. I was like, well, why not? Like, you said the right answer. And he was like, I'm not ready to make that commitment. I was like, what do you mean? And he's like, well, if I become a Christian, then there's some commitments about living a certain way. And he was 12. And I was like, man, you're right. Can I talk to you again in a couple of months? And he's like, yeah. So we just kept coming back to it, and about 6 months later, he did become a Christian. But that was a really honest answer, especially when he knew what I wanted for him. He knew what his mom wanted for him. But he was honest enough to say, I'm not there. And I need to wait until I am there. Okay? So if that's what you mean by that, that's something that can be addressed on your part. It's outside of my control. There's a degree of that's true. For a marriage to take place, it takes the agreement of two people until you cross the ring going on and exchanging your vows, right? But it takes both people agreeing to that. I want to please God. Now let's talk through these, and especially as we get to the fifth one. I don't believe in marriage. Well, that's probably based on experience. And the answer to that is we just need to remember God's standard. Marriage is very good. God designed it. I want to live for myself first. There may be some truth to that. If what you mean is, like, I want to get my education out of the way, there are some things I want to do to prepare myself for that relationship, then great. If what you mean is that you want to live your best life now until you're 50, there's a problem with that. I mean, you're living a selfish life, okay? And that's going to affect more than just your relationship status. It can create really bad habits that are going to follow you into marriage if you ever do get married. Like if you choose to live for yourself first, no Christian should be doing that anyway, because you should be living for Christ first, okay? 1 Corinthians 6, we'll look at that in a minute. This may be legitimate. It could also be something else. Like I know some people that are like, I'm just not ready for that, but they'll never be ready for that because they just choose not to work on what they need to work on themselves. Okay, so if you're choosing to stay that immature, then that's a problem. Okay, and I'll say this too. I don't care how much you've been preparing yourself and maturing. You're never going to be 100% ready when you get married. You're just not. I mean, there are things that you're going to learn and change and grow in after marriage. So be thinking about that side of it. This could be someone who hasn't found someone. It could be a divorcee. Like I know a couple, one of my really good friends, married for 25 years. Three kids. I went to their 25th wedding anniversary. It was beautiful. It was really exciting. And within 12 months of his 25th wedding anniversary, he came home from work one day and the locks were changed and a process server serving him because his wife was like, I'm out. He did not choose that. Okay? That was outside of his control. You know, people whose spouse has passed before them, they don't choose that. That's just part of living in a broken world. There's death. And so death takes place. Okay? I want to please God. This should be every unmarried believer. Okay? If you're single, but you want to be married, but you're not married yet, it's because you have some standards that you're looking for in the person that you're trying to find. And that's great, and hang on to those standards. You're choosing to stay single until you find someone that meets those standards. Okay? And we're going to talk about this some more. Any questions about all of that? Yes.
I feel like all of these reasons have the background assumption that marriage is going to happen.
Or that marriage is desirable. They may be desiring marriage. Not everyone does.
Right, like Paul.
Like Paul. And we're going to talk about Paul. We're going to go to 1 Corinthians 7 here in a little bit. And I know a couple of people that are like, I don't care. I'll be single the rest of my life. There's one individual that I know that's just like, I don't want to get married. I don't have any desire to get married. And I'm perfectly fine serving God as a single man. That's great. That was not my desire in my 20s, but that's where he is. And if that's where he is, good for him. As long as he's using that season in an appropriate way. But the average person is looking for a spouse. And maybe that has to do with some of the things that we teach about marriage and singleness. I don't think we promote singleness like we ought to, like a 1 Corinthians 7 approach, like Paul did. I almost think in our cultures, in our church cultures, we're hammering on marriage. And those sweet yentas in the church are like, we're going to make this happen. And, you know, the parents are like, when are the grandbabies coming? And, like, there's just this culture that is so marriage-centric that we put way too much pressure on people. Anybody else? Yeah.
Just in regard to wanting to please God through marriage, I don't remember where I heard this, but I may have been you last year, I don't know. But you should only get married if you can glorify God more
Yep.
by
Yep.
And so that automatically creates a standard for you, but also for the other person. And
Yes.
like, neither of you have to be perfect, but you both have to be willing to grow.
Yeah.
Seeking Jesus through it.
Absolutely. I'll put another reason up there. Nope, let me go back. I didn't initially put this on here the first time that I taught it, and I really need to add it on there. It's on that last one. I want to please God. Through the course of doing these workshops, I have met people that are choosing not to get married because they struggle with same-sex attraction. Praise God for them. They're just like, I'm not attracted to the other gender. I don't have a desire for that kind of relationship. I don't know that I could fulfill my responsibilities toward them if we were to get married. So I'm just going to choose to be single because it wouldn't be appropriate for me to act out on my attractions. So I'm trying to figure out how to glorify God as a person that wrestles with same-sex attraction and trying to be faithful to Jesus. Praise God for that person. I've met some of those people. Okay. And if that's something that you wrestle with or want to talk through some more, let me know. I'm happy to have that conversation. I've had it several times. But I think we need to acknowledge that in our church cultures too, that that's a possibility that someone may be single. And so if people don't know that and you have a good-hearted yenta in your group and they're like, we're going to fix you up, I know the sweetest thing, and they're like, I don't need to meet the sweetest thing. But how do you have that conversation without just like blowing her mind? That takes some really good listening, right? Okay, so let's stop for a second. We're at 10:52. We're not done with this part, but we can roll it into the next one and just keep going. Let me say a really quick prayer. We'll take a really quick break, use the bathroom, stretch, get a drink, whatever, and then just come back in as quick as you can. Let's say we'll get started at 11:05, give you about 10 minutes. Let's go ahead and say a quick prayer. Heavenly Father, thank you for blessing us with the opportunity to be here this weekend and to encourage each other and to better understand what your word has to say about marriage and singleness, and to help think through some of the hurdles that may be there because of that. Please help us in the next little bit as we talk through 5 principles of singleness and how to glorify you, and to look at 1 Corinthians 7, what Paul had to say there about glorifying you in the season of singleness. Thank you for every single person who's been contributing and asking questions and making comments, and we pray that we're glorifying you and saying things that are consistent with your word. Bless us through the course of this weekend and be with us through this really quick break. In Jesus' name we pray, amen. All right, 11:05 is when we'll start our next one.